Professor Cotler, thank you so much for being here. You've been a great inspiration to me throughout my whole life and legal career. You've done so much in your career. You were a member of parliament from 1999 to 2015. You're a minister of justice from 2003 to 2006. You are currently the chair of the Roel Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. You are known as a leader in human rights throughout the world, and you've done so much. Simply saying you've been an inspiration to me would be really not doing you justice, because you've not only been an inspiration, but you've actually provided or facilitated providing people physical freedom, which is the ultimate gift. I'm curious to know about your background. Where did you get such a strong moral compass? And when did you know you wanted to pursue a career in law or human rights for that matter?
Actually, I think both those questions go back to the teachings of my parents of blessed memory. It was my father who taught me at a very young age, when I really couldn't fully appreciate the profundity of the message, but he would, repeat it over the years. And the moral compass message, in effect, was that the pursuit of justice, and he would also use the Hebrew, tzedek, tzedek tirdo, the pursuit of justice, he said, is equal to all the other commandments combined. He said, this is what you must teach unto your children. He said, this must be your life's credo, in effect, your moral compass. But I have to say that when my mother would hear my father sharing this message with me, over the years, she also imparted her own message, which was that if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and beyond and feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, as she put it, the pursuit of justice will be a theoretical abstraction. So I suspect that as a result of the teaching of my parents, which was buttressed by when I was in Jewish day school, two of my teachers were Holocaust survivors. They didn't speak early about this, but over a period of time, they shared their stories. And I think that also had that, connectivity back to my parents' message. When you're exposed to horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. And the thing that I always feel, from whether we're talking about the Holocaust or the genocides that followed, whether it be in Rwanda or Darfur, or more recently with the Rohingya and the Uyghurs, that what makes the Holocaust and the genocide that followed so unspeakable, and not only the horrors of the genocides themselves, that would be bad enough. What makes them so unspeakable is that they were preventable. Nobody could say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. And I mentioned the Uyghurs because we know now and we're still not acting. So I think the moral compass goes back early teachings of my parents, Jewish day schools. And I have to also say that when I was in high school, the person who taught me the secular studies program, he taught all the secular studies, was Irving Layton, the poet. Therefore, to this day, I know nothing about physics, chemistry, and math, because he taught the whole secular studies program. But he embodied in him, really, almost the personality of a kind of Jeremiah. He almost looked like one would have thought Jeremiah. And he always railed against injustice and always implored us to pursue justice. So the remarkable thing was that Irving Layton was taking me back to the messages of both my parents. And then in my father's friendship circle, and with this I'll close, included people like David Lewis. My father himself was a lawyer. I like to say more a jurist than a lawyer. He would always read to me from the great jurists of the day. So he was the personification of a jurist in the best sense. And his friends were people like David Lewis, who went on to head up the New Democratic Party, A.M. Klein, a great Canadian poet, Frank Scott, who taught my father at McGill Law School and who eventually taught me. And so there was a lot of this camaraderie, and I think that brought everything together.
Wow, unbelievable. And your journey into law, was that following in your father's footsteps, or did you know back then that law was a good way to make a difference in the world of human rights?
I think the juxtaposition of my father's message and my parents' messages about pursuing justice and combating injustice, my father being a lawyer, those of his friends like David Lewis and others also being lawyers, but who all had a passion for justice, led me to believe that the way to pursue justice would be to do it through the law. And so I learned early on that this could be a pathway to justice. And so by the time I was in high school, I already knew that this is what I wanted to do.
Wow. Inspirational. And I say that because I also studied law, partially like you, to try to make a difference and help people. And I still want to do that, but I find myself doing, real estate closings and estate planning instead. So I'm wondering, what was your first job in law? Did you go straight into the human rights field, or did you have some private practice experience at all?
Well, after I graduated McGill Law School, I did graduate work at Yale Law School. And I actually was on my way, having done the LLM, to a doctorate when Pierre Elliott Trudeau was elected in 1968 Prime Minister. And there was that feeling of hope at the time that Camelot, to use that metaphor, was in the air. And I remember writing a letter to the newly appointed Minister of Justice, John Turner, whom I did not know. And I basically wrote him a letter saying, I'm here at Yale, I'm doing my PhD, but I'm getting somewhat intellectually hydrated here in the library and the like. I really would like to get involved in issues relating to law reform, human rights, poverty law, as I learned it at Yale. And he invited me to an interview, and a week later invited me to work with him. And so my first job was with John Turner when he was Minister of Justice. And the great thing about that experience is that it exposed me both to the importance of Parliament and the notion of Parliament as a place where decisions take place, and that parliamentarians are the trustees of the people. And he was not only a consummate parliamentarian, Turner, as Minister of Justice, he took Parliament very seriously, but he was a consummate Democrat. He taught me all the time that, democracies don't happen by accident and they don't continue, that you have to work at democracy, and Parliament has to work at democracy. And as Minister of Justice, he gave me a lot of scope to be involved in areas of criminal justice reform, judicial reform. We established institutional reforms through the Federal Court of Canada and Law Reform Commission of Canada. But he was also very involved in issues that today have become maybe much more commonplace. But he was a real environmentalist. Environmental protection for him was crucial. So it was one of the pillars of the work that we were involved in. Human rights was crucial. And so we embarked then on what ultimately was to become the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. He cared a lot about law for the poor. And through that, we worked together on establishing a neighborhood legal services system, which we borrowed from Yale Law School, my clinical experiences there. So the timing was perfect. The person whom I was working for, John Turner, could not have been a better mentor and a better role model about what it means to be a Minister of Justice, a parliamentarian, a Democratic. And interestingly enough, when I became Minister of Justice and Attorney General myself years later, some 40 years after that experience, I have to say that I had that role model in mind, and luckily enough, it was my first job.
Wow, that's really incredible, and what one job and one experience can really propel a whole career forward. Beautiful to see and hear. I mean, we can pause at the 70s and 80s and even 90s, but if you want, you can touch upon those decades, or we can go into your years of as Minister of Justice and as a parliamentarian. I'm curious to know back then, what were the big issues on the table, and what maybe accomplishments are you proud of during those years, and what are you perhaps disappointed in?
Yeah, the two issues that engaged me most were the two great human rights struggles of the second half of the 20th century. Interestingly enough, I started to be involved with them when I was still a law student. I'm speaking now about the struggle for human rights in the former Soviet Union, and within that, the struggle for Soviet Jewry, and the struggle against apartheid. And with respect to those two struggles, I got involved with the two people who were the voice, the vision, the hope, the identity of those struggles. Anatoly Sharansky, as he then was in the former Soviet Union, and Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And in fact, my involvement in the Sharansky case allowed me to develop then what became the advocacy model that I use to the present day with respect to defending political prisoners. Sure, with the refinements over time, but the basic framework was set at that time in my involvement with those two cases.
What was the framework? Can you go into that?
Yeah, the framework was basically, number one, a lesson that I learned when I was in the Soviet Union from the person who was regarded as the father of the modern dissident movement, Andrei Sakharov, became also a political prisoner. Was very close with Sharansky, and he would begin by saying the importance of the mobilization of shame against the human rights violator. He would say that the Soviet Union is preoccupied with its legitimacy. Therefore, we have to unmask and expose their human rights violations. And the best way to do so was to do so through legal representations and public advocacy related thereto. And so I drew up a legal brief in that regard, which sought to expose and unmask the Soviet Union's violations of its own law, not Canadian law or American, but of its own law, and of its violations of international treaties along the lines of what Sakharov would say. And then there were other things to involve the parliaments. And here too, I have to say that, or let me even take it back a step further, as you invoke your own government. And so the Canadian government at the time when I took up the Sharansky case was led by Pierre Trudeau. And I went to him with Avi Charney, and I presented him the 800-page legal brief that I had developed with regard to Sharansky's case and cause. And I asked him if he would help facilitate the delivery of that brief to the Soviet Union and help support and take up Sharansky's case and cause. And I still remember his words to me. We were meeting with him on a Friday, and I think Avi Charney made a very compelling case in that discussion with him. And then he said to me, "Okay, Cotler, I'll take the brief home for the weekend. I'll read it. If it's good, you'll have my support on Monday morning. But if it's lousy, I'm going to kick your ass in for wasting my weekend." And so on Monday morning, he got in touch with Avi Charney and myself, and he said, one, that he had already instructed his people to have the legal brief formally conveyed and served on the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. Two, that he had arranged for a press conference for us to take place in Parliament, and thereby giving the imprimatur of both government and Parliament for our work. And number three, that he had already made representations to the leaders of the Soviet Union, in particular with regard to their violations of the Helsinki Final Act. So that involvement was very important. Now, to tell you about the bipartisan nature of the involvement is that a year later, the Trudeau government was defeated by the conservative government, progressive conservative under Joe Clark. Joe Clark took up exactly where Trudeau left off, and he helped to facilitate my appearance before a Soviet court to defend Sharansky. I won't go into the whole thing there other than to say that a day before I was to appear before the Soviet court in an arrangement agreed upon with the Canadian government, I was arrested, detained, and expelled from the Soviet Union. And I was brought out to a Soviet officials brought me out to the Soviet tarmac when they were expelling me to a Japanese airliner, which fortunately was going to London and not to the Far East. And I was boarded onto the airline to the surprise of the Japanese attendants who asked me, they said, "Your boarding pass, sir?" I said, "I'm sorry, I've been boarded in unusual circumstances." And I pointed to the KGB people and I said, "Look, I'm being expelled." I asked them two things very quickly. I said, "Could you convey to the Canadian embassy in Moscow that I'm being expelled? And can you call Dan Fisher, the Moscow correspondent for Los Angeles Times, and tell him I won't be able to make it for dinner?" So I had a dinner meeting with him on the Sharansky case, as it was. What happened, and it tells you about the importance and the role of the media, is that Dan Fisher broke the story. And it was front page news all over the world. Nobody knew who I was, but Sharansky's case was a cause célèbre at the time. And so everybody knew who Sharansky was, and all the headlines were, Sharansky's lawyer arrested, Sharansky's lawyer expelled from the Soviet Union. I have to tell you that on the trip from Moscow to London, it was a very difficult trip because I worried about those who had been left behind. All my documentation had been seized, all the list of witnesses whose testimony I wanted to share before the court, all that was taken. And I was very worried that there were going to be consequences for those who had been left behind. And when I arrived in London, I quickly called my wife. I was only been married at that time for 3 months. And I said, Ariel, I said, don't tell anyone, I've been expelled from the Soviet Union. I'm here in London. And then she said, what do you mean don't tell anyone? It's all over the news. And then she said, by the way, there are Canadian officials looking for you in the airport. What happened is that the Canadian government was really, to use their words, outraged by the Soviets' expulsion of me, and they arranged a press conference for me in the Canadian High Commission in London so that I could tell my story, because the Soviets were saying that I was a spy who came to the Soviet Union on behalf of another spy, Anatoly Sharansky, and that I was consorting with hooligans, meaning Andrei Sakharov, etc. So they organized a press conference, but the most important thing with this, I'll end on this. When I flew back to Canada, the then foreign minister, Flora MacDonald, in an important symbolic move, met me at the airport and then announced that Canada was suspending all bilateral Helsinki agreements with the Soviet Union because of their imprisonment of Sharansky and the expulsion of his lawyer. So it showed you governments acting on principle and enacting policy, and that to me was very encouraging. So this notion of invoking the support of your own government was an important dimension. Invoking parliamentary support. To this day, the Canadian Parliamentary Group for Sharansky and for Soviet Union is the largest that has ever been organized on behalf of any political prisoner or on behalf of any cause, and it was done at the time. And there were other things that I learned, the importance of the media, using the Dan Fisher example, to internationalize the advocacy, to get other governments and parliaments involved, to create a critical mass of advocacy. And so we involved women's groups, the 35s as they were called at the time, student movements, lawyers. This was a quintessential intersectional movement, to use that term that we use today, because you had involved students and lawyers and scientists and artists and women, and really a critical mass of advocacy, and that advocacy was internationalized. and we invoked international legal remedies, which were only beginning at the time. Today, there's a full slate of them, but whatever did exist, we engaged with at the time. So there was this advocacy model developed then. And just to close on this, because a very interesting thing occurred about a year after Sharansky was released, I found myself on a panel with Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union. And I always wondered, what role Gorbachev had played, because Sharansky was released within the year that Gorbachev had become president of the Soviet Union, and he had been in prison for 8.5 years before that. And so I asked Gorbachev, what role did he have in Sharansky's release? And he told me a fascinating story which dovetails with the advocacy model. He said, when I was in the Soviet Union before I became president, I was the Secretary of Agriculture. He said, you may not believe this. He said, I never heard of Anatoly Sharansky. He said, I know he was, as they say, a co-celeb. I never heard of him in my role. My first trip outside the Soviet Union was to Canada, to the Canadian Parliament. And as the Minister of Agriculture from the Soviet Union, I appeared before the Canadian Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture. He said, yes, they asked me a few questions on agriculture. He said, then they started to ask me questions about this Sharansky. He said, when I left the parliamentary hearing, left the parliamentary building, there was this gigantic demonstration on behalf of this Sharansky. He said, then I was being hosted over the weekend by Eugene Whalen, your Minister of Agriculture at the time. He said, yes, we discussed agriculture, but he kept bringing up the Sharansky case. He said, well, a year later, I became president of the Soviet Union, so I ordered up this file of Sharansky. And he said, I read it. He said, yes, he was a troublemaker. He said, but he wasn't a criminal. And then he added the key words. He says, but it was costing us. It was costing us diplomatically. It was costing us economically. It was costing us politically to keep him in prison. So I ordered his release in our self-interest. And that for me was the other part of the advocacy model, what I called the tipping point. You can make the case on the basis of the injustice, but what will get these authoritarians to move is when they realize it's in their self-interest to release the political prisoner.
Really unbelievable. Both such success stories, Nathan Sharansky and Nelson Mandela, two happy endings, and you should be extremely proud of yourself. I know I would be if you contributed towards their freedom and their influence on the world post-freedom. They were both, Nathan Sharansky is still an amazing leader, and Mandela was, so to have contributed to that in a way is really a great accomplishment. On the flip side of that, you talk about the receptiveness of the parliament and the media to those cases. Have you found throughout your career and as a parliamentarian as well, that some of your complaints about human rights violations have fallen on deaf ears?
Yes, when I was a parliamentarian, that's why I use the term the golden years, the time of the struggle for Soviet Jewry, when there was this unity, government, parliament, civil society, legal advocacy, the convergence of public advocacy in the pursuit of a just cause. When I became a parliamentarian, interestingly enough, not long after I became a parliamentarian, I was asked to take up the case of Professor Kunlun Zhang. Kunlun Zhang, as it happened, had been an academic colleague of mine at McGill University, but he was also a Falun Gong practitioner, and he had gone to China. And when he was in China, he was engaged in some of the exercises of this spiritual meditation movement, the Falun Gong, and he was arrested, and he was tortured in detention. And the Falun Gong movement in Canada approached me to take up his case and cause. You know, if you're a corporate lawyer and you're known to being involved in corporate law, you'll get clients who'll come to you as a corporate lawyer. I had my involvement then in political prisoners, Sharansky, Mandela, and also they came to me with regard to now a Chinese Canadian political prisoner. And so I took up his cause and sought to invoke the advocacy model. And as you may have, intimated, maybe not knowingly, I did not get a positive response. Why? because the government at that time was very interested in trade relations with China, in developing, commercial relationships with China. And the Canadian government was about to embark on a trade mission to China. And so they advised me not to take up the case. What I'm sharing with you actually became public in the media at the time. And I said, I don't see the contradiction between trade and human rights. There's no reason why you can't go on a trade mission and still take up the case of Kunlun Zhang and human rights while on the mission. But that did not have positive resonance, I have to say. And so I called a press conference and brought all representatives from all the parties together and ratcheted up the advocacy. Well, to sum it up, with that intensive parliamentary advocacy, though not necessarily with the government's support, Kunlun Zhang was released. But that's the good news. The not so good news is that the series of political prisoners in China whose cases and causes I took up thereafter are, for the most part, still in prison in China. I took up the case in 2002 of Dr. Wang Bizang. He had been a graduate of McGill University. He got a doctorate in medicine from McGill, but then decided, it would be nice to practice medicine, but democracy in China is more important. And so he established the Overseas China Democracy Movement. Fast forward to 2002, because he had graduated from McGill, his PhD in 1982, it's 20 years later. And he's in Vietnam. Chinese authorities abduct him from Vietnam, bring him back to China in a sham trial, convict him of both the absurd charges of terrorism and treason, and sentence him to life imprisonment in solitary confinement, during which period he suffered a series of debilitating strokes. And just 2 days ago, I addressed the Canadian Law Students Association meeting and highlighted, among other things, his case and cause. And there are several others. There's a Uyghur Canadian, Hussein Jalil, similarly, 2006, brought to China, and since then charged, sham trial, has effectively disappeared. And so we've been taking up his case and cause. You've got the two Michaels now in prison in the hostage diplomacy. So it isn't as easy as it was in the, if you might call it, the bipolar world then of the Cold War, one might say, when the Soviet Union was seen as the common enemy. The democracies were more united, and we were able to effectively make the case as I shared it with you. It has not been as, at this point, as effective when you have a situation where you have what I call today a global political pandemic, which we've had for some time, of a resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, the assault on human rights, and political prisoners increasingly as looking glasses into this resurgent global authoritarianism and violations of human rights.
Yeah, in a sense, we have gone backwards. I'm curious now, fast forwarding, you're opened and you're the chair of the Royal Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. You're no longer in Canadian government. In your eyes, what are the biggest human rights violations or human rights violators today, 2021? What are the big issues on your table?
Yeah, let me share with you the sort of the 5 issues on our table. It's within the context of what I said, the global political pandemic, and political prisoners as a looking glass into it. The first, I would say, is Xi Jinping's China. And I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics in China who are otherwise the targets of the mass repression of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, where they have targeted what they call the 5 poisons. by the five poisons, I'm referring to the targeting of the Uyghurs, the mass atrocities against the Uyghurs, the frontal assault on the rule of law in Hong Kong, where they've been imprisoning not only leaders of the democracy movement, but effectively assaulting democracy itself. The third has been the persecution and prosecution of the Falun Gong. We're now in the 22nd year of what the CCP itself has called the eradication campaign against the Falun Gong, effectively criminalizing what is a spiritual exercise meditation movement. The fourth is the massive repression against Tibetans, and the fifth is the menacing of Taiwan. But it doesn't end there. China, and it's not all that well known, now jails more journalists than any other country in the world. And it was this suppression of information, this arresting and disappearing of media people and doctors and dissidents that resulted effectively in the suppression of information, which precipitated the spread of the coronavirus, which China then sought to blame on others. And we're witnessing and experiencing the after effects to this day. You also have the targeting of Uyghurs, Falun Gong, and others for the illegal and forced harvesting of their organs, which a human rights tribunal in China under Sir Jeffrey Nice said these were effectively crimes against humanity. And so you take all of these things together. That's why I say that China has emerged as the greatest threat to the rules-based international order, and the most horrific of that culture of corruption and criminality and the impunity that underpins it is really the mass atrocities targeting the Uyghurs, which effectively constitute acts of genocide, as the Canadian Parliament determined and became the first parliament internationally to do so. So that's the first threat that we're involved in, and as I say, involved both in combating that global authoritarianism emanating from China and through the defense of political prisoners in that regard. The second is, and again I use the term Khamenei's Iran to distinguish it here too from the people and publics of Iran. They're too the targets of mass repression. Now, in 2008, December 2008, our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights published a report called Rights Over Repression in Iran, where we sought to both document the repression, the targeting of the major civil society groups in Iran, and identified the major, as we call them, architects of repression engaged in that. I have to say, regrettably, that in some 26 months later, the situation has only worsened. The repression has intensified. I'm referring to the targeting of women and the women's rights movement, which has emerged as a leading human rights movement in Iran as a whole. The targeting of environmentalists, where environmental protection, which is in the interest of Iran, has been made a crime. The targeting of the Baha'i, not only targeting them for religious persecution, but outrageously, recently, from a legal point of view, 2 court cases which authorized, in effect, the illegal confiscation of the property of Baha'i in a village of Evel, where they've lived, for over 100 years, and justified it on the grounds that the Baha'i are a heretical sect. In other words, there's no shame. They were, in fact, acknowledging that they were illegally confiscating this by judicial orders, the property of the Baha'i, because they regarded them as a critical heretical sect. I can go on in terms of the situation with regard to Iran. You have also the increasing targeting of dual nationals. Again, a form of hostage diplomacy, but as we're speaking, they have recently imprisoned and convicted a dual Canadian Iranian national, someone who got his PhD from McGill University, who was a student of mine, who went back to Iran, who became a professor of law and human rights, in particular environmental law, and he has now been sentenced to 7 years in prison. And the contempt of Iran is demonstrated in the fact that almost on the same day that Canada led 58 countries in adopting the first ever declaration against arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations, i.e. the first declaration regarding the imprisonment of dual nationals, Iran imprisons a Canadian Iranian, a dual national. So you really see this relentless assault on human rights in Iran, all of which is personified in the case and cause of Nasrin Sotoudeh, the heroic woman human rights lawyer in Iran who embodies the struggle for human rights in Iran, whose persecution and prosecution over the years has been emblematic of the criminalization of fundamental freedoms in Iran, a lawyer who has gone down the line for women targeted for abuse and violation, gone down the line for juveniles destined for execution, down the line for journalists whose freedom of expression has been silenced, down the line for environmentalists whose environmental protection has been made a crime, down the line for other lawyers who, when they defended these political prisoners, were themselves in prison, down the line for other political prisoners, until she, 2 years ago, became yet again a political prisoner, convicted and sentenced to 38 years in prison and 148 lashes, a virtual death sentence for a woman in her late 50s, and where the charges are so absurd in the sense that for obeying the Iranian constitution in terms of their protections for peaceful protest or for freedom of expression, she was charged with 7 different offenses that comprised, as I said, those 38 years in prison. So we have been advocating on her behalf and her case as a looking glass into all these violations. Another concern that preoccupies us has been Maduro's Venezuela. Now, some 4 years ago, I became a member of a what was called a independent panel of legal experts established by the Organization of American States to look into whether there are reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela. After an exhaustive inquiry, both with documentary evidence, witness testimony, and the like, we determined that there were 7 major crimes against humanity being committed in Venezuela, from multiple murders, thousands of extrajudicial executions, some of the most egregious cases of torture that one can imagine, the targeting of detainees for rape and sexual violence, persecuting people on the basis of the fact of their political identity, disappearing others, and perhaps the worst of the crimes being state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering, the weaponization of food and medicine, such that we have appalling cases of infant and maternal mortality, which had been unknown before, diseases which had no longer existing, now returning, malaria, diphtheria, tuberculosis. So hundreds of thousands of the illnesses and deaths that were preventable. And so within months of our report, Canada led 7 other countries in the first ever collective referral of a state party, namely Venezuela, to the International Criminal Court by state parties to the International Criminal Court. I'm saddened to say that even though our report, our OAS findings of fact and conclusions of law, has been supported by similar findings by the UN Human Rights Commission, and most recently by the OAS's special advisor on the responsibility to protect, Jared Genzer. He and Luisa Malgro, Secretary General to the Organization of American States, determined in their exhaustive report not only confirmation of the 7 major crimes against humanity that we had determined, but in fact were condemnatory of the special prosecutor of the International Criminal Court for not opening an investigation, even though Venezuela was a state party to the International Criminal Court statute, even though the referral was made by 7 state parties to the International Criminal Court. So no investigation was open here, but it has been open in other cases where it did not have the same jurisdictional basis or authority or criminality to do so. And yes, now the interesting thing with regard to Israel, or the case read the situation in Palestine, is here that the ICC special prosecutor determined that she had jurisdiction, even though Israel was not a state party to the ICC, even though Palestine was not yet a state. Now, I've been a longtime advocate for Palestinian statehood, but as a matter of law, it is not yet a state. And if it is not a state, it cannot confer or delegate jurisdiction to the International Criminal Court. And so what happened is that effectively law and fact were turned on its head. It was the special prosecutor imputing jurisdiction by imputing or assuming jurisdiction by imputing statehood to the Palestinian Authority, which in the absence of statehood could not have conferred that jurisdiction on the court. So an Alice in Wonderland situation that we're witnessing, and I say this with great regret, because as somebody, and I've been involved in the ICC from its inception. One of my first acts, you referenced my work as a parliamentarian, one of my first acts as a parliamentarian was in fact to move legislation to implement domestically the Rome Statute in Canadian law. 2002, I hosted the first ever parliamentary assembly for an international criminal court, and have been engaged ever since with support for and involvement with the International Criminal Court. So what disturbs me is that a court that was to be a court of last resort, that even deals with other matters why the case is otherwise inadmissible because of the complementarity principle and the like. But what is so disturbing about all this is that those of us who were hoping that we would have an independent, impartial, international tribunal, which would be the successor tribunal of last resort along the lines of Nuremberg, are finding a tribunal that regrettably has become politicized and is undermining thereby its own mandate. And the situation in Palestine is not the only example of its kind that I could give.
It really calls into question the whole legitimacy of the court, and I'm just as disappointed as you. I studied it and had great hope in the ICC, but recent events just are disappointing, frankly. Getting back to your human rights violations, you were going on Venezuela. Are there others that you want to?
Yeah, 2 others that I'd mention. MBS is Saudi Arabia, as we're speaking. The U.S. administration has declassified an intelligence report that has, in fact, exposed MBS as having been responsible for the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I want to just say that we, Wallenberg Center and myself, have been representing a number of political prisoners in Saudi Arabia, including, as we speak, Raif Badawi, who was imprisoned. He's now in his 9th year of imprisonment for saying then what the Crown Prince has been saying himself the last 3 years. Now, speaking of the need for a more moderate Islam, a more open Saudi Arabia. For him doing that, he was charged and, as I said, now in prison in his 9th year. And all he did was put up matters on his blog that effectively were saying and reflecting what the Crown Prince himself has said. His sister, Samar Badawi, has also been in prison. She was calling for the right to drive, a reform that MBS, to his credit, instituted, but then imprisoned the women who had been calling for the right to drive. Or his lawyer, Raif Badawi's lawyer, who was sentenced to 15 years in prison for doing nothing other than representing Raif Badawi. And as we're speaking, we have just gotten word about the apparent threat to reintroduce other criminal charges against Raif Badawi. We're issuing a statement today about it because this would be shocking. Not only has he been falsely imprisoned for the last 9 years, but the threat emerging today of further charges and further imprisonment. So I would put it this way: it is in MBS's own interest, apart from the injustice of Raif Badawi's case and cause, to in fact release Raif Badawi, because this is yet another tipping point situation, and where he has found himself compromised already with the Biden administration. MBS doesn't need another unjust imprisonment or worse to, in fact, buttress the existing concerns with regard to the Khashoggi cover-up, murder, and the like. And just one other point here, and I talk about the resurgent global authoritarianism having been accompanied by a backsliding of democracies. 2.5 years ago, the then Foreign Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, tweeted a call for the release of Raif Badawi and his sister, Samar Badawi. What happened is the Saudi authorities erupted in fury, ejected the Canadian ambassador from Saudi Arabia, recalled the Saudi ambassador from Canada, suspended all trade and investment with Canada, recalled 15,000 Saudi students studying in Canada, really a self-inflicted wound. Why I'm saying all this is not one democracy came to Canada's defense. And 2 months later, we had the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi. In other words, one can almost draw a straight line between the silence of the democracies enabling the Saudi authorities, who then went ahead and engaged in the brutal murder of Khashoggi, believing that they could do so with impunity. Now we're seeing that the impunity is catching up in the Khashoggi case, and I would hope they would not be embarking on any criminalization regarding Raif Badawi, because it will catch up with the Saudi authorities if they purport to do so as well. The final case I'll mention is Putin's Russia, where we know about the recent first poisoning and then arrest of Alexei Navalny, and the arresting of journalists and members of the opposition who've been demonstrating in protest against Navalny's imprisonment. What is not as well known is that in the last 5 years, the number of political prisoners in Putin's Russia has increased 7-fold. And so Putin's Russia is another priority on our agenda. And we have taken up, for example, there too, the case of Anastasia Shevchenko, who became the first political prisoner to have been arrested under Putin's foreign registration law, which was supposed to be targeting NGOs from abroad. That was bad enough. In this instance, the NGO she was heading was a Russian-based NGO, and she has nonetheless been charged under that law. So these are the 5 of the resurgent global authoritarians and the political prisoners, looking glass into them, whose cases and causes we've been taking up.
It's very sobering to speak to you. I mean, it gives a lot of perspective and makes me realize how lucky we are sitting here in a first world country with the freedom of speech and the freedom of movement. We have all the freedoms. Running a business here, and these places in the world don't have the luxury that we have. And I'm just thinking over here, what could us lawyers do? You talk to law students. I'm sure you hear this question all the time. But what could we do to contribute to the cause and make the world a better place?
Well, you mentioned an important point, and that is we do live in a democracy. And so we have the freedom to take up these cases and causes without risk, unlike the political prisoners that I've mentioned who are putting not only their livelihood, but indeed their lives on the line. So in effect, it's our responsibility, if I can put it that way, to speak on behalf of those who are striving to be heard, to bear witness on behalf of those whose testimony is being suppressed or hidden, to act on behalf of those, as I said, who are not only putting their livelihood, but their lives on the line. And I think we can join in taking up these cases and causes. In other words, what I have found, as I try to share with you, is that this critical mass of advocacy can bring about release of political prisoners. We can, unmask and expose the massive human rights violations that are taking place. And, when I look around in the world, while I've been describing to you, terrible cases of repression and mass atrocities, and the Uyghurs keep coming to mind. At the same time, I feel encouraged by the brave people who are putting themselves on the line. Those who are protesting in Belarus, for example, those who are, as we meet, those who are protesting in Myanmar, those who are protesting in Venezuela. In other words, and I have to say, the more I look at these protests and the more we're engaged with them, more and more you see that there are women who have emerged at the forefront of these protests. And I just mentioned Venezuela. There's a case there of a courageous judge, Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni. She, some 11 years ago, acquitted a political prisoner in Venezuela. As a result of that, she was herself arrested, brutally tortured in detention, where she still remains in detention. And after her 10-year imprisonment was to have concluded, they brought new charges against her of quote unquote spiritual corruption, an invented charge. She is a real looking glass into the assault on the rule of law, on the independence of the judiciary, on human rights in Venezuela. Why I say that is because what has become known as the Afiuni effect has been used to intimidate other judges, other witnesses, and the like, threatening them that what happened to Judge Afiuni, that could happen to you. And I'll give you just one example. Leopoldo Lopez was a leader of the Venezuelan opposition. He too was falsely charged and imprisoned. We were holding hearings, our Organization of American States legal panel in Washington, and a woman testified before us, a judge, Renata Tovar, and she said she had been ordered by Maduro to issue a false arrest warrant against Leopoldo Lopez on pain of the Afiuni effect. In other words, if she did not do so, she would suffer the torture and detention and abuse that Judge Afiuni. We then had Franklin Neves, the special prosecutor in the case of Leopoldo Lopez. He also escaped. He also appeared before our inquiry, and he said he had been ordered to issue false charges against Leopoldo Lopez, lest he too end up with the Afiuni effect and so on. So the Afiuni effect has become a metaphor for intimidation and assault, as I said, on the rule of law, on the independence of the judiciary. So we should be taking up the case of Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni. We've now made representations. We recently have taken up her case, and we're utilizing all the UN special procedures for that purpose. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the Special Rapporteur on the Independence of the Judiciary, and the like. So lawyers, young lawyers, can involve and assist in the drawing up of these legal proceedings, in the filing of these complaints, in unmasking and exposing these human rights violations through evidence gathering and the like. In other words, there's no shortage of things that need to be done. What we do need is those who can make themselves available and get involved in the trenches of human rights. Now, I'm not saying that everybody and most people, there are not jobs for them to be available, let's say, working with human rights groups and the like. But I'm saying the same way that we all get involved in one form of pro bono activity or another, one effective pro bono work can be take up the case and cause of a political prisoner. I've named 5 today whose cases and causes we can join in. And through the looking glass of those political prisoners, help unmask and expose the human rights violators. And together we can bring about justice for the victims and accountability for the human rights violators.
In light of the slow wheels of justice, I'm wondering if you're optimistic about the future or hopeful.
Well, I'm an optimist by nature. And so I do believe, as Martin Luther King would say and others, that the arc of justice ultimately, bends towards justice. But we have to help the bending of the arc in the purpose and pursuit of justice. So I'm optimistic because with all the human rights violations that I mentioned, I see more and more courageous young people, willing to take to the streets and defend these rights and put themselves on the line and confront these authoritarians. That's why I say from the comfort of our democracies, we can try and join with them. I also remember Turner's motto that it's also about in what we say, or more importantly, in what we do, we make a statement about ourselves as a people. We make a statement about ourselves as people. And that holds true for democracy as well. It does not, as he put it, Turner, again and again, he would remind me that democracy does not continue by accident. We have to work at it. And so it's a convergence both of working in the promotion and protection of democracy at home and working in confronting the global authoritarianism and injustice abroad. And let's remember, these political prisoners are really going down the line for the values that we hold dear. I'll never forget Sakharov, and on this particular point, when I met with him, he said, that the trial of Anatoly Sharansky is the trial of human rights in the Soviet Union. That his trial is the attempt by the Soviet Union to imprison human rights by imprisoning Sharansky. And then he added the words I never forgot. He said, remember, he said, Sharansky is each and every one of us. Sharansky represents us all. In other words, the universality of human rights and why these political prisoners are standing up for the things we care about, and therefore we need to be there for them.
That's beautiful. And like I said, your life's work has really made a difference. One of the most influential lawyers and careers I've seen. Is there any bit of general advice you'd like to leave the younger generation of lawyers? Any general advice to law students that you can maybe end on?
Well, maybe the quote that the late Robert Kennedy used to invoke from Bernard Shaw, just coming to mind, that some people see things as they are and ask why. I see things as they might be and ask, why not? I think young people can be change agents, and they can bring about the world we'd like to be.
Beautiful. And I look forward to doing my part to contributing towards a better world. And hopefully the listeners of this podcast and your followers, so to speak, will continue your mission and make the world a better place.
Thanks, Avi. I just have to tell you that at our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, we have a wonderful cohort of young people. And that's what also makes working with the Wallenberg Center so inspiring. We have people like Brandon Silver, who's our Director of Policy and Projects, and he's at the forefront of these struggles that I've been mentioning. We have Yona Diamond, who's our legal advisor, and he's at the forefront of preparing these legal cases. We have Judith Abitan, who's our Executive Director, who's involved in the framing of the agenda, our organization. We have my daughter, Irwin Cotler, who's been herself a pro bono lawyer, etc., who's going to be joining us soon as well. And we've got a wonderful board, a wonderful group of young people who are volunteering as interns and the like. And so that makes the Wallenberg Center an inspirational place to be every day. And those who might want to join us or find any other way to do so, we can, to get back to my father and mother's message, we can pursue justice every day.
Beautiful. Well, it sounds like you've got a great team and you're making a great difference in the world. And I'm going to donate some of my pro bono hours to the Raoul Wallenberg Center. And like I said, it's the most important work you can be doing is providing others the freedom that we all deserve and standing up for democracies and all our important values. So thank you for your whole career and for the work that you continue to do. It's really a source of inspiration to us all.
Thank you, Avi. It's been a pleasure talking with you and conversing with you. And let me tell you that we will welcome you with outstretched arms whenever you're able to find the time to join us.
Fantastic. Thank you. I look forward to it, and I'm sure we'll be speaking more again if that's the case.
Absolutely. Wonderful. And stay safe and healthy.
You as well. Bye for now.
Take care. Bye-bye.